So recently I talked about noise and ISO and how it all works. I also mentioned a technique that might help mitigate that noise named ETTR, or exposed to the right. In that video I covered very briefly what it is, why to use it, but I didn't really dive into the how. So let's correct that. But first, what is this thing? So this is a histogram. And when you're trying to employ exposed to the right, this fine feature is going to be your friend. Your best friend. Besides me, of course, right? So before we get into ETTR, let's talk about the histogram, understand what it does, and why it's going to be important for this technique. So to start off with, a word to the wise. If you're going to view your histogram on the back of your camera, which I do encourage you to do, make sure that you keep in mind that when you're reviewing your photos on your camera, you're looking at a JPEG preview of your photo and histogram. But I shoot in RAW. Yes, you do. At least I do. That preview on the back of your camera is going to be a JPEG representation of the raw image that you took, not the actual raw image itself. Reason being is those previews on your camera, on the back of the camera, or if you have an electronic viewfinder, are there to check your composition and focus. You can check the histogram in the moment with those as well, and you can readjust as needed. So these histograms and previews are meant more as a guide, and not exactly a detailed representation, since a JPEG is going to be a compressed version of your raw image that loses some of the information from that raw file. So when you're viewing the histogram on your camera, in Photoshop or any other kind of editing program that you might be using, there are some things that you should know about the histogram and how to use it. So yeah, this thing. So just like making graphs in math class, we have an X and a Y axis on this graph. So starting over here on the left-hand side of this graph, at the intersection of the X and Y, this point along the X-axis represents the darker elements of your photo, or the shadows in this case. So then, as we start to proceed to the right on that x-axis, our tones will begin to lighten a little bit. So we go from our shadows to the darker tones of our photo. Then moving along to the middle of the histogram will be our midtones. And then further on to the right, beyond the midtones, are going to be the lighter tones in our photo. And then all the way to the right on the graph is going to be the highlights of our photo. So that x-axis, or the bottom, represents the brightness of your image. Then as you go up in the histogram in an elevation vertically on the y-axis, that's going to represent the amount of your photo, or the amount of pixels that you have in your photo that are within that range. So when that is all piled up together and you get kind of a slope in your histogram, that represents how all of those tones are distributed within your photo at the various brightness levels and in what quantity. Now, of course, if you pile up all of your pixels on the extreme one side of the histogram or the other, you start clipping your highlights and your shadows. And when you clip the highlights or the shadow in your image, you're going to lose data for those areas in your image. So when you clip those highlights or shadows and lose that data, you're not going to be able to recover those highlights or shadows at all within your image to bring out details from those highlights or shadows. So now that you know what your histogram looks like and what it does, now you can start to employ the exposed to the right for your photos. So the nice thing about utilizing this technique is that if you are shooting at a higher ISO and want to be able to naturally reduce the noise, exposed to the right is one of the best ways that you can do that without getting crazy or going nuts in software during post-processing. So when you do this, there's a little bit of experimentation that will be at play here as well. There's no one hard and fast rule that you can apply to every situation. One of the first things that I do when I'm getting set up at a scene is to take a couple of initial shots that are properly exposed either via the light meter, using the Sunny 16 rule, or a combination of the two. Then from there, I'll check the histogram on the camera of the test shots to see where I'm at. If it's properly exposed, then I should have a nice sloping mound on the histogram. Then from there, I will start to push my exposure so that way the shots that I take are slightly over the correct exposure, either by opening up my aperture or slowing down the shutter just slightly, or again, a combination of the two. Usually a third stop in these instances will be more than sufficient to achieve that change. At that point, those follow-up photos should be represented with a histogram that has the piles of pixels higher, a little bit to the right of the vertical center of your histogram. So now one of the reasons that I won't bump the ISO in these cases is because I'm already attempting to expose with a higher ISO that I want to eliminate the noise in. Then as your light or your scene changes, you can adjust accordingly. You'll want to occasionally check your images and check your image previews in order to see where the histogram lies, so that way you can make those adjustments. This would obviously be a little bit harder when you're shooting a moving or dynamic subject like wildlife or vehicles or sports or the like. But if you can take a moment to review on the back of your camera, you can then adjust as needed. So like I said earlier, there's some experimentation to this, so feel free to try it out and play with it a little bit. Use a little bit of that "I wonder what would happen if" energy to see what you can get out of using exposed to the right. So now that we've covered the exposed to the right technique for taking photos at a higher ISO and understanding what the histogram looks like and what it does, and how you can use that tool to affect your photography and check your exposures and employ this technique, go out, try it. Like I said, use some of that "I wonder what would happen if" energy to try out these techniques, experiment with it, take some great photos. Next time, I'm going to cover some post-processing techniques that you'll need to use in order to reduce the ISO, to reduce the noise within your images that you've taken at a higher ISO. So if you're looking for any other information about using different software, or you want to see the difference between Photoshop and AI tools, make sure to check out this video right here, because that will give you everything that you need to know about using or comparing those tools with each other. So thank you very much for joining me, and I'll see you again next week. My fingers are cold. My watch just buzzed. I think I've moved enough.